Okay, so we are beginning this episode with ethics, diversity, and global relevance. Today we are joined with Garima Gupta, and I would want her to open the stage by discussing why ethics is no longer a side conversation.
So, for a very long time, ethics in neuroscience was treated as something separate from science itself. It was something you addressed after the study was designed, something handled by an ethics committee, something that lived in different section of the paper. But that separation didn't hold anymore. As behavioral and translational neuroscience moves closer to prediction, intervention, and real world deployment, ethical questions aren't just constraints, they are part of the science. So, in this episode, I want to think ethical challenges facing the field today, especially around prediction, diversity, and global relevance. I also want to talk about what responsibility looks like when neuroscience starts making claims about risk, how to engage with these issues thoughtfully without losing scientific focus. In my opinion, this isn't about perfect answers. It's about asking better questions.
Right. So, moving on to the next question. So, what are the most pressing ethical issues in behavioral and translational neuroscience today, from intervention to AI-driven prediction?
Okay, so one of the biggest shifts in behavioral and translational neuroscience is that we are no longer just describing behavior. We are increasingly trying to predict it, such as predict risk or predict treatment response or predict decline. And with that shift, the ethical stakes change. For example, invasive interventions, whether pharmacological or neuromodulatory or surgical, they raise about proportionality, that uncertainty is before intervening in the brain, or who gets to decide when shall benefits outweighs risk. At the same time, AI-driven predictions introduces a different sets of concern, like when models predict vulnerability to substance use or neurodegeneration. The question isn't whether the prediction is accurate, asking like how accurate is the data that these population is more prone to suicide or subregion neurodegeneration. The question is who sees this information and how is it coming and what happens to the person once they are labeled as high risk. Ethics here isn't abstract. It's embedded in design choices, threats, communication strategies. One thing increasingly clear is that more powerful our tools become, the more responsibility shifts upstream to researchers, not just filmmakers. So we can say that ethics is no longer comes after discovery. It shapes what responsible discovery looks like.
Right. So, how do issues of diversity, culture, and socioeconomic context influence both behavioral neuroscience or behavioral measures in this domain and the generalizability of neuroscience or neuroscientific findings?
Okay, so this question brings us directly to the questions of diversity and global relevance. You know, a large proportion of behavioral neuroscience has been conducted in relatively narrow populations, that is often from similar cultural, educational, and socioeconomic backgrounds. And that has consequences. Like behavioral tasks that don't, behavioral tasks don't exist in vacuum. They rely on assumptions about motivations, interpretation, and familiarity. For example, a task that measures risk taking or impulsivity in one context may capture something very different in another. The same is true for neural and digital measures. For example, patterns learned from one population may not generalize, not because the biology is fundamentally different, but because context shapes expression. Socioeconomic stress, access to healthcare, education, nutrition, and exposure all interact with neural and behavioral development. So when findings don't replicate across population, it's not always a failure. Sometimes it's a signal. It tells us that our models are incomplete or too narrow. We can say that from a translational perspective, mostly. Also, if neuroscience is going to in clinical practice globally, it can't rely on assumptions derived from a small set of humanity. So, diversity isn't just about representation, it's about validity.
Right. So, what responsibilities do researchers have when their work yields predictive numbers or, really just predictive markers pointing towards that of risk? For example, let's talk about suicide or neurodegeneration or substance abuse.
Okay, so I think one of the most difficult ethical challenges arises when research starts producing predictive markers of risk. For example, markers associated with suicide vulnerability or early indicators of neurodegenerative disease or predictors of substance use relapse. These scientifically valuable and potentially life-saving, but they also raise serious questions such as what does it mean to tell someone they are at elevated risk, especially when no definitive interventions exist? Does the action empowers or does it burden? There's also the risk of false positive, a marker that predicts risk at a population level may be far reliable at an individual. Yet, once a label is applied, it can shape how a person is treated by clinicians, institutions, or even themselves. So, researchers have responsibilities beyond statistical accuracy. They have to consider factors such as how predictions are framed or whether uncertainty is communicated clearly and how findings might be misused outside their intended context. This is especially important in psychiatric neuroscience, where stigma is already a concern. Prediction can do harm. So, ethical responsibility doesn't end with publication, it extends to how findings enter the world.
Right. So, let's talk about ethics as a part of translational rigor and not just an add on. So, what are your thoughts on that?
So, one thing I find important is resisting the idea that ethics sits in opposition to rigor or innovation. In reality, ethical often improves science. It forces clarity. It makes us ask what exactly are we claiming, or who does this apply to, and what could go wrong if this is misunderstood. So, ethical thinking sharpens questions rather than diluting them. Also, it pushes us to design studies that are more transparent, more inclusive, and more cautious about overgeneralization. In that sense, ethics is deeply aligned with reproducibility and translation. We can also say that a finding that only works in one context, one population, or one framing is unlikely to be robust scientifically or ethically. So, ethical reflection isn't a detour from good science, it's part of what makes science trustworthy.
Right. So, how can a prospective PhD student, do you think, show awareness of these dimensions without making the proposal, very unfocused or purely sociological?
Okay, so for prospective PhD students, ethical awareness can feel tricky to articulate. There's often a fear of sounding vague, political, or unfocused. But ethical awareness doesn't mean turning a neuroscience proposal into a sociological one. What faculty usually appreciate is precision. I think, in my opinion, strong applicants tend to acknowledge the limits of generalizability, or they show awareness of who their finding may or may not apply to, and also think carefully about how results could be interpreted beyond the lab. For example, instead of broadly stating concerns about ethics or diversity, an applicant might say, I'm interested in how behavioral markers validated in high income settings generalize to population with different socioeconomic stressors. That keeps ethics tied directly to mechanism and translation. Similarly, acknowledging uncertainty doesn't weaken a proposal, it signals maturity. Ethical awareness, when done well, sharpens scientific focus rather than diffusing it. It shows that a researcher understands the broader consequence of their work and is prepared to handle them responsibly.
So, I would want you to share your thoughts about ethic as a condition for trust. What would be your take on that?
So I can say, when I think about ethics, diversity, and global relevance in neuroscience, I don't see them as external pressures on the field. In fact, I see them as conditions for trust. If neuroscience is going to inform how we understand behavior, risk, and interventions, especially in psychiatry, it has to earn the trust. That means being honest about limits, being careful with prediction, and being attentive to who our science serve and who it might exclude. Um, for me, engaging with these questions doesn't feel like a distraction from science. It feels like part of taking science seriously. And as someone hoping to pursue a PhD in this field, that sense of responsibility is something I want to carry forward alongside curiosity and rigor. So thank you everyone for listening patiently. Thank you for being such a great audience.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. I would like to extend my thanks to you as well for being the part of the podcast. With that, we wrap up this episode.